available on PCCD's website under funding opportunities by the end of the week. And I'm also going to drop the PDF version into the chat toward the end. And if you want to view that, the best way to do it is to click on the 3 dots and download it so you can use the links inside. Questions that are put into the chat will not be addressed during the presentation, but will be addressed through our website. So take a look at the funding opportunities and the Q&A for STOP, and we'll address any questions that are put into the chat. And you can also submit questions through our RA account, which will be responded to on the website. The RA account is ra-obs-stopgrants@pa.gov. Okay. All right. So during the webinar, we will provide a brief background information on the Violence Against Women Act. We will review the current STOP solicitation funding announcement, and we'll discuss submission requirements and outline next steps in the competitive grant process. So we can go to slide 3. Sorry, Brian. Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency is the lead criminal justice planning agency in Pennsylvania. Among its duties is to distribute state and federal funding to support a variety of programs in court, law enforcement, prosecution, adult and juvenile probation, child advocacy, and gun violence prevention. PCCD's Office of Victim Services mission is to provide help to victims of crime. They do this by administrating the VCAP, or Victims Compensation Assistance Program, and distributing multiple funding streams to support services for crime victims across Pennsylvania. This would include the STOP grant and the VOCA grant, or Victims of Crime Act grant. We encourage you to visit the PCCD website for a full understanding of the commission and our offices. And I will pass it to Natalie. Nat, you're on mute.
Of course, I'm on mute. I do that all the time. My name is Natalie Novotny-Goals, and I supervise Mike, Desiree, and Tanya, and together we work on the STOP Formula Grant Program. So just a very brief overview, because a number of you I know are already familiar with STOP. We're also providing some links to things so that those of you who aren't as familiar with STOP can educate yourself on the program through looking at additional resources. So the Stop Violence Against Women program is a federal funding stream from the Department of Justice, and it's administered by the Office on Violence Against Women. So the grant program is authorized by the Violence Against Women Act. You'll hear the acronym VAWA a lot. And the VAWA needs to be reauthorized by Congress every 5 years. The most recent reauthorization of VAWA was in 2022. STOP stands for Services, Training, Officers, and Prosecutors. And while women is in the title, victims are eligible to receive services regardless of gender or gender activities. The STOP program promotes a trauma-informed, multidisciplinary approach to improve the civil, criminal, and juvenile justice response to crimes against women. And when we say crimes against women, we're talking about domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. And it does this through implementation of comprehensive victim services, law enforcement, and prosecutorial strategies. Efforts under STOP must be trauma-informed, prioritizing the safety of victims while holding offenders accountable for their crimes. So one of the things that is unique about STOP is that it is very specialized. The legislation underpinning the STOP program sets specific conditions for us allocating the funds and practices or services that are delivered by grantees. Because STOP is so specialized, the grantees who ultimately receive it are held to and must abide by certain requirements. Next slide. So just getting into the allocation of funds required by the STOP program. This is basically how Pennsylvania has to divide up the money that we receive from OVW. So 25% of our allocation has to go for services and programs that benefit prosecution, 25% for programs that benefit law enforcement, 30% for victim services, and 20% is discretionary, depending on the needs of the project. Next slide, please. So one of the principal things about STOP that you have to remember is that collaboration is essential. So every STOP grant project has to have something called a STOP collaborative team. And what the team does is it's responsible for overseeing the grant. Budgets for STOP grants obviously have to adhere to the percentages that were on the previous slide. So every STOP grant that comes in will have a law enforcement budget, victim services budget, and prosecution budget, with the remaining 20% distributed across the three categories based on the needs or the particular type of activities that you have proposed in your project. So obviously we realize that collaboration is difficult, but in those counties where we have had successful STOP projects, each part of the collaboration really values the insight, expertise, and professionalism of the other. That doesn't mean that people don't disagree, but they work through the issues and they memorialize each partner's role in the response through written STOP protocols for domestic violence and sexual assault. So we'll talk a little bit more about what a STOP team is and the requirements for the response protocols later on in the presentation. Next slide. The other thing it's important to remember about the STOP Formula Grant Program is its philosophy. As mentioned earlier, but it bears repeating, the underlying philosophy of STOP is that multi-system collaborative response to domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence has to balance the need to keep victims of these crimes safe while holding offenders accountable. So this is an important consideration when applying for STOP funding because there are specific practices and programs that the Office on Violence Against Women does not support, as they are harmful to victims or allow offenders to avoid accountability. Next slide. And Tanya will take over.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So kind of how we get here is through the STOP implementation plan, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And every state and territory must produce these every 4 years and have it approved by OVW, who is the funder here, before we're able to disperse the grant. So just think of that as a blueprint for types of projects that can be supported under STOP. Our plan is the product of a multi-step process that involves statewide representation from a variety of stakeholders in the field who work with victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So the goals, objectives, purpose areas, and guiding principles discussed in the plan drive the content of the STOP solicitation and drive how PCCD makes decisions regarding what applications to fund. So you can take time to read the plan. We'll send this out after the presentation. I can't really emphasize enough that before you apply, you take a look and read the plan. In January 2024, we reconvened the Implementation Planning Committee and asked them to review and consider several changes that took place in the 2022 reauthorization of VAWA. The recommendations regarding those changes are contained in Appendix G of the plan. It's important that applicants read that part to understand some of the new purpose areas that the committee adopted. The bottom line is that projects must be able to fit somewhere within the the intentionally broad goals, objectives, and purpose areas outlined in the plan. Mike, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so over the next several slides, we're going to talk about basic requirements that need to be met prior to completing an application. So next slide, please. As stated in the funding announcement, all applicants must register with SAM and receive a unique identity ID. You can see the federal application requirements page on PCCD's website for further information. Again, you'll have these links when I drop this PDF into the chat. The website will walk you through the steps to complete this process. The first step in the application, this is the first step in the application process, and it is recommended that you give yourself sufficient time to meet the requirements if you wish to apply. Next slide, please. Also be aware that every criminal justice entity participating in STOP must submit a UCR, Uniform Crime Report, data to the Pennsylvania State Police. To use eGrants, you must have at least 2 users registered for the applicant agency. The quick links at the bottom of the PCCD's website has the links for eGrants. You will be able to register and log in as a registered user through that website. For questions, contact eGrants Help Desk at the numbers provided on the slide. There's a toll-free number and a 717 number. Select option 9 and then option 6. You can also email the eGrants RA account at ra.egrantsupport@pa.gov. And I will now pass it to Desiree.
So the next section that we're going to go over are the STOP federal certification requirements. To be eligible to receive STOP program funds, states must certify that they are in compliance with certain statutory requirements of VAWA regarding polygraphing, fees for costs for protection from abuse orders, judicial notification of the prohibition of firearms, providing medical forensic examinations when victims choose not to report to law enforcement, and support evidence-based prosecution. PCCD assures the certifications by requiring them of subgrantees. If you apply for STOP funding, you do need to certify that your county's practices and policies abide by these certifications, which we will go over briefly in the next few slides. Next slide, Brian. There we go. So the first one that we're going to go over are the costs for criminal charges or protective orders. So the bottom line for this is that victims can't be asked to pay for PFAs or for bringing charges against their offender at any point in the criminal or juvenile justice process. And victims also cannot be charged for the filing, issuance, registration, or modification or service of a PFA or an SVPO. Protective orders do include protection from abuse, sexual violence protective orders, and protection from intimidation. The next one is in regards to the forensic rape examinations. Pennsylvania's Victims Compensation Assistance Program covers the payment of forensic rape exams. So the exam must be covered in full, which means that the victim must not be billed. And also victims are not required to speak with or cooperate with law enforcement in order to have a free examination. The next one is judicial notification. There do have to be mechanisms in place to notify offenders about the possibility that they could lose their ability to possess firearms if they are subject to a final protective order or a PFA, or if they plead guilty or are found to be guilty of a misdemeanor crime related to domestic violence. The next one is in regards to polygraphing or other truth-telling devices. Pennsylvania's current polygraph policy is uploaded into eGrants in the VAWA eligibility compliance certification section. Please make sure you do review that when you are applying. The polygraph policy is basically twofold. First, a government official cannot ask or require a victim to submit to any truth-telling device as a condition for proceeding with an investigation. And second, if a victim of sexual assault refuses to submit to a polygraph examination, that should not be grounds for refusal to pursue an investigation. The next one is the newest certification added as a result of the VAWA 2022 reauthorization. This is evidence-based prosecution. All currently funded counties under STOP are aware of this certification and should be working on meeting this requirement. If you would be in a county that is not currently receiving STOP funds, you will have the full 3 years to meet this requirement. Now, what this involves is getting trained on evidence-based prosecution practices and creating prosecution practices or protocols that call for the use of other options that use evidence gathering in the investigation rather than forcing the victim to testify. Now, this does not mean that you can never ask a victim to testify. It just means that you will exhaust all the other options and that this will be a last resort. This certification came about to reinforce the central philosophy of STOP that we discussed earlier. As you all probably know, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking are often reluctant to testify because of a variety of different reasons, including fear of retaliation or further abuse from the offender. Basically, they are afraid for their safety. So this will help affirm the philosophical idea of keeping victims safe while holding offenders accountable. The last one here is the legal certification, legal assistance certification. So VAWA requires states to certify that attorneys supported with STOP funds must be trained in the dynamics of violence against women. Applicants proposing to use STOP funds to support attorneys to assist victims with protective orders and or other issues associated with violence against women crimes must certify that such attorneys have completed or will complete the necessary training in connection with domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence and related legal issues in order to effectively carry out their duties under the grant. This certification is embedded in e-grants also, as I mentioned earlier, with the other certification, and it is under STOP statutory requirements. So I will pass it off to Tanya.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the STOP purpose areas and priorities. Next slide. So county governments and nonprofits are eligible to apply. You can also see more information about all of this in the funding announcement, but there's a total of $12 million available over the next 3 years. So that breaks down to about $375,000 to each program over 3 years. So each yearly budget cannot exceed $125,000. Projects will then need to submit a continuation for your application for years 2 and 3, which isn't too involved of a process. So the main application is, of course, done this year. There's no match requirement for these grants. Federal legislation governing VAWA requires that states provide a 25% match. So Pennsylvania received permission from OVW to use its state budgetary allocations for domestic violence and sexual assault to meet this match requirement. So this takes the burden off of individual applicants. We'll also be monitoring these grants. We'll be monitoring the process or the progress of successful grantees in meeting their yearly goals and objectives 1 time per grant cycle. So next slide. So some basic eligible activities and expenses are listed here, including but not limited to personnel, benefits, training, supplies, and that more details and more eligible and ineligible activities are listed in the funding announcement. As part of your grant application, you are required to select the purpose areas of your grant. So the purpose areas that you should choose should be a reflection of the goals and objectives.
Looks like it doesn't know if it wants to get sunny or rain, but it's damp and
sorry, just let me mute. Okay, sorry. So yeah, the purpose areas chosen should reflect the goals and objectives of your project and what you write in your application. And just a note of caution, you don't need to select all of them. It does not give you more points if you select them all. Just select the ones that are relevant to your projects. Our reviewers will be looking for cohesion and substance throughout your application, so we want that to make sense. So a project that focuses its time and resources on a well-defined specific set of issues has a more likelihood of achieving its goals than a broad project that addresses a number of vaguely defined areas superficially. So the next slide just goes into some of the new purpose areas that were covered in the reauthorization of 2022, like we talked about earlier. And the next slide. So in our STOP implementation plan, we highlight 3 focus areas that are required by federal guidelines governing STOP. So these are culturally specific and underserved populations, sexual assault set aside, and domestic violence homicide reduction. You can read more about the specific objectives in our plan in the funding announcement and linked throughout this document. For underserved populations, there is a difference between underserved and culturally specific. Brian, you can go to the next slide. Underserved populations can include race and ethnicity, geographic location, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, language barriers, immigration status, or age. The broad scope of underserved populations need to be community-based and based on U.S. Census data for the project's county and region. When a project selects that they're serving an underserved population, it's important to explain your level of expertise that is going to meet that culturally specific population's need. Like, are there already partnerships in place? What you plan to do to specifically meet that population's needs. Underserved populations also are populations who face barriers in accessing and using victim services. They could be underserved because of race, ethnicity, geographic locations. Like I said, partnerships between these are strongly encouraged. You can attach anything to your application that may already be in place. Let's see. Next one, under STOP. Next one, Brian. Sorry, I covered that. Under STOP, states are asked to dedicate at least 10% of their victim services allocation to serving culturally specific populations. So, like I said, OVW sets this definition for what constitutes a culturally specific group. This includes Asian Americans, Blacks, Latinos, and other groups defined by the United States Census. In particular, STOP encourages the development of working relationships between mainstream victim service organizations and community-based organizations that serve culturally specific populations. So, as noted in our implementation plan, Pennsylvania's fastest growing culturally specific program is the Latino population, and this growth is not happening in a uniformed way in Pennsylvania. There are pockets of diversity throughout Pennsylvania, and we encourage all applicants to look through current census data for their specific provision areas as part of writing your STOP application. Realizing also that building trust with culturally underserved populations takes time, and often your entrance into that community is aided by collaboration with another organization that already serves it. And for example, the Spanish American Civic Organization. Let that person be the introduction to your organization. Cross-training, collaboration, and sharing a grant of grant resources between your organization and theirs can build lasting partnerships that will reap benefits in your community for years to come.
Excuse me, before Desiree takes over, could we go back to slide 25, please? So I just wanted to say, because this is no criticism of Tanya, that I just want to highlight some of the newly added purpose areas under VAWA 2022. So there were a number of things in terms of purpose areas that were added in 2022. States have the discretion to adopt all of them or some of them. And that's why we pulled together our statewide implementation planning committee to take a look at all of the purpose areas, these new things, and then they voted and decided which ones that Pennsylvania would adopt. So I just want to highlight some of these things that are now possible for you to do if it fits with your community and the work of your program. So the first one is improving evidence collection in domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking cases through the use of improved technology. So one of the things that they discussed in VAWA 22 was the fact that not all of the cameras and light source type things that people use to document injuries work as well on black or brown skin. Additionally, they want to encourage people to think about, you know, how you're responding to BIPOC victims and how you're documenting their injuries and looking for those injuries. So the second area was providing culturally specific services to victims of female genital mutilation and cutting. So what they're saying here is that you may, and this could happen anywhere in Pennsylvania, but you know, one of the things is you may have a victim who initially comes to you because of sexual assault or domestic violence. But as you begin to develop a relationship with them and through counseling, etc., you may find that they also are a victim of FGM or have been cut. And so this is one other area where you can expand your services and develop services targeted to the needs of victims who have experienced these types of things. And then the third area is something I think that advocates in the field have been asking for a number of years. Those of you who work with victims, particularly domestic violence victims, know that a lot of times they just leave and they are not able to take, or, you know, if they don't have a plan in place already, they're not going to remember to take their birth certificate, things like passports and different state furnished IDs that, you know, we all know you need to get access to benefits to start rebuilding your life. So VAWA 22 says that stop formula grant funding can be used to pay those fees for victims who need a birth certificate or a passport, etc., because the offender has ripped it up or stolen it or whatever else. So I just wanted to talk briefly about these three new things that have never been in there before. Okay, thank you. Now, Des, you can talk on slide 30, sexual assault set aside.
Okay, so for the sexual assault set aside, OVW also asks that states allocate 20% of their funding across at least 2 allocation categories to initiatives that meaningfully address sexual assault. Pennsylvania encourages the development or enhancement of sexual assault response teams, training for law enforcement and prosecution, and evidence-based practices for prosecution, training for hospital staff and nurses on the response to sexual assault, collection of forensic evidence through sexual assault forensic examinations, and training of sexual assault nurse examiners. So what does it mean to meaningfully address sexual assault? Some projects have defined this as intentional, sustainable, and trauma-informed. That it's an ongoing priority and mission driven. Everyone is heard. It's intentional, purposeful interaction, ongoing holistic approaches, real measurable change. It's outcomes based and it is sustainable. The next slide addresses the domestic violence homicide reduction. Under the reauthorization of VAWA in 2013, states are encouraged to implement evidence-based domestic violence-related lethality assessments. In Pennsylvania, PCCD provides funding to the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, or PCADV, to implement the Maryland model of lethality assessment in counties across the state. The Maryland Lethality Assessment Program, or LAP or LAP, uses an evidence-based screening tool designed to identify victims of domestic violence who are at the greatest risk of being killed by their abusers. The LAP requires close collaboration between law enforcement and local domestic violence programs. Law enforcement officers receive specialized training to administer the screening tool at the time of response to a domestic violence incident involving intimate partners. Victims who are identified to be high risk for lethality based on their responses to the questions on the screening tool are often referred to immediate advocacy and assistance through a phone call to an advocate who has also received specialized training on safety planning in high risk situations. Currently, 36 of Pennsylvania's 67 counties are participating in implementation of LAP. Applicants for STOP program funds proposing to utilize STOP funds to engage in any type of lethality assessment activities must agree to work with PCADV and implement the lethality assessment program with fidelity to the Maryland model. So the guiding principles, Pennsylvania STOP implementation plan also contains guiding principles. Applicants are encouraged to explain how these principles will be infused or upheld throughout their projects. Only pick the ones that make the most sense in the context of what you're trying to accomplish. Just to briefly kind of go over them, first is cultural appropriateness. This promotes and reinforces culturally appropriate response through collaboration with agencies that specialize in culturally specific and underserved populations. Next is the diffusion of knowledge. When feasible, training should be recorded and shared with PCCD and other providers. Advanced training programs should provide training opportunities that go beyond the basics, beyond 101. The last is trauma-informed practices. You support a trauma-informed approach by all partners that is a victim-centered and also avoids re-traumatization. Okay, so for the core direct services to victims, the STOP plan reaffirms Pennsylvania's commitment to preserving core services to victims as outlined on this slide. Victim services are a fundamental part of the collaboration mandated by the STOP program and a crucial channel to promote victim safety, autonomy, and recovery. These are some of the core direct services that victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence may need. We do encourage STOP teams to reintegrate these services into their response protocols. Okay, next I will briefly go over specialized units. STOP also focuses on maintaining specialized units in law enforcement and prosecution. The goal of this specialization is to develop expertise in investigating and prosecuting domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. This increases police and prosecutor understanding of the traumatic impact of the crimes on victims and promotes trauma-informed approaches to these cases. So for law enforcement, when we talk about specialized units, we're talking about the intentional dedication of time and resources. We don't doubt that the dedication of criminal justice staff to their respective missions, but a dedicated, well-trained law enforcement officer or prosecutor in violence against women can give you the resources that you need to have a go-to person or persons in your county to help with the response to and investigations of these crimes. If multiple law enforcement positions are included in the budget, they must be adequately justified. And for prosecution, the criminal justice system is a critical resource for victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and dating violence. If it is ineffective or indifferent to victims, they may be left vulnerable while offenders are not held accountable. Communities become less safe and justice is not achieved. Violence against women incidents are complex crimes that require an informed criminal justice response that considers and accounts for the effect of collateral consequences on victims. A dedicated prosecutorial position can obtain the training necessary to effectively use evidence-based prosecution strategies as outlined in the new evidence-based prosecution certification that I spoke about earlier. So I would pass it over to Mike.
Mike, you're on mute.
I knew I was going to forget to take myself off mute. Sorry about that. So for training, STOP funding can support training for police, prosecutors, victim advocates, and other key partners to improve their response to domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking in their service area. For example, funding can support attendance at national conferences such as the End Violence Against Women Annual Conference. STOP funding can also be used to bring reputable trainings to the STOP team as a whole, the multidisciplinary team. The applicant must provide letters of support from team members to demonstrate that they will attend if the grant is funded. And there are several requirements that are unique to STOP that we will review over the next couple slides. One of the things is a STOP collaborative team that must be established and must include all required team members as outlined in the funding announcement. You can refer to page 14 of the solicitation to see that list. Some of the required members, though, include victim service providers, district attorney, law enforcement, and healthcare representatives. The team is also required to meet 4 times a year and should be documented. And we're ready for the next slide. So for meeting minutes that must be maintained, they must maintain a comprehensive minutes, which should include a date and time of the meeting, attendance, topics discussed, member contributions to the discussion, decisions and resolutions, and action items for follow-up. And also be aware that minutes will be requested as part of the monitoring process. Remember that collaboration is a big part of STOP, and this is one way to demonstrate that collaboration. All STOP funded counties must complete written response protocols for domestic violence and sexual assault, and we'll discuss that further in the next slide. So protocol development. Developing and updating protocols should be a collaborative process. Everyone on the team should know their roles and responsibilities in response to victim violence against women crimes. Protocols should address all required components as detailed in the protocol development guides released by PCCD. We encourage you to review these guides during the application process, which are also available via the link in this slide. Current STOP subgrantees are required to have their revisions completed by December 31st of this year. And I'll now pass it to Natalie.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that you can't do under STOP. When I had talked earlier about certain things that OVW does not allow because they've been shown over time to be harmful to victims or allow offenders to evade accountability. Next slide. So you're probably sick of hearing this by now, but I can't say it enough. The whole philosophical basis of STOP is victim safety and offender accountability. So if you take a look at pages 10 and 11 of the solicitation, there's a pretty extensive list and more of a explanation of the things that aren't allowed under STOP. So the key to this is that the things that you're doing on your grant cannot jeopardize victim safety, re-traumatize victims, or undermine offender accountability. So when we think about things like that, we're looking at refusal of services based on discriminatory practices. VAWA is much more comprehensive than some other federal grant programs on its civil rights and anti-discrimination provisions. Procedures that compromise the confidentiality of victims, requiring victims to report abuse to law enforcement, placing restrictive conditions on services, requiring mediation or couples counseling, failing to include safety planning and services, and penalizing or imposing sanctions on victims for failure to testify against their abuser or perpetrator. Next slide, please. So along with practices that can't be engaged in, there's also ineligible program activities. And for those of you who have applied for other federal grants, some of these will be familiar to you. You can't engage in lobbying in terms of promoting legislation. You can't use your funding to pay a lobbyist. You can't do fundraising with federal money. The other thing under STOP is that notice that it's the Stop Violence Against Women program, and that's very intentional. You cannot use STOP funding for services that focus exclusively on children. And by children, the Office on Violence Against Women defines that as baby to 10. Now, what you can serve victims under STOP aged 11 to whatever. So just remember, like adolescents, teens, adults. You can't pay for moving expenses, and that's because some of this can be covered in our crime victims compensation program. You can't buy standard law enforcement items. So those are things like a uniform, a gun, and also body cameras. We did have that question recently, and the body camera is considered standard issue law enforcement equipment. Can't buy mechanical lie detection equipment. Again, that goes back to that certification against polygraphing sexual assault victims. You can't pay immigration fees. So you can provide assistance, legal assistance, an immigration attorney, et cetera, to help a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. But as far as any fees that need to be paid to become a citizen of the United States, that cannot be covered through VAWA. Unfortunately, you can't buy food and beverages if you're using STOP money to pay for a training. Construction and renovation of buildings, vehicle purchases, home office and related utilities, honoraria. So let's just say you want to give a special award to somebody, or host an event at which you acknowledge people for participation on the STOP team. That is not allowable. You can't do pure research, building renovations, and you can't do exclusive prevention programs and media campaigns. It has to be about serving people. Next slide, please. There are some other special conditions, and these are detailed really exclusively on pages 11 through 13 of the solicitation. So there's the non-disclosure of personally identifiable information, the requirement to report your any type of breach of personally identifiable information to PCCD within 24 hours. All of you are familiar with hackers who break in and take over county or educational or hospitals' computer system. That's the kind of stuff they're talking about, where they can get in and get people's names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, and then sell them, et cetera. That's the kind of thing you have to have a policy in place for how you're going to deal with that if, God forbid, it should ever happen. Again, you have to make sure that the people that you hire under STOP are legally eligible to work in the United States. I think most people your organizations do this already. You have to have a policy for workplace sexual misconduct and domestic violence. Many of you have it already because of your HR policies, et cetera, but those are things that are vital if you're getting STOP funding. There's also a new federal certification around background checks or the suitability to interact with participating minors. So this is something that not all STOP grants, it may not be relevant to your STOP grant, but that's something I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of right now. If you need to have it, PCCD staff will work with you to make sure you have the appropriate types of policies to be in compliance. Again, I would hope that no one who's interested in STOP funding is participating in human trafficking. That's kind of a no-brainer, but the other thing that people need to think about is, for instance, let's say you're using a cleaning service or something to come in and clean your office buildings or something. If you knowingly know that firm that you have the contract with is using people who are trafficked, you are still culpable just as much as that firm is for employing trafficked people. And again, this is a no-brainer too. I would hope that none of the organizations on this webinar allow their employees to look at pornography on work time. I'm sure you don't. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, please. Well, actually, it's not that it's okay to look at pornography when you're out of work. Just don't look at pornography at all. So, okay, I always manage to somehow stick my foot in my mouth when I do things like this, but I just want to make sure I was very clear about that. So there's also financial accountability. When you have federal money, most of you who have federal grants, if you have a VOCA grant or a JAG grant or any other kind of funding, that there is guidance that comes out of the federal government, Office of Management and Budget, about certain things that you have to have. So obviously you need to have auditable records. You need to have a financial system that accurately accounts for the funds that you receive. And you got to make sure that you're accounting for your STOP funds separately from all the other funding that's coming into your organization. And obviously, you've got to have some strong internal controls and proper segregation of duties to guard against fraud, waste, and abuse. So if you go onto PCCD's website under the funding tab, you take a look at that. They have a lot of these things are outlined in more detail in a more comprehensive and easily accessible way. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about the sections and the scoring of the applications.
Okay, so over the next several slides, we're going to get into the specific application requirements and the scoring of these sections. So we can go to the next slide, which is the executive summary, which is worth 5 points. And it asks you to provide the program name or applicant name, total amount of funding requested, a brief explanation of what you plan to implement, and a list of what the funds will be used for. And a script is built into eGrants that will walk you through this section. This is a basic overview, and you will have an opportunity to expand upon your project in subsequent sections of the application. So we'll go to the next one. And this is the problem description. This is worth 25 points. And so at the beginning of this part of the application, current STOP recipients are asked to provide an update on their project and the protocol development using the protocol development tools. Applicants should discuss the demographic makeup of their service area to include culturally specific and underserved populations, as well as socioeconomic and geographic conditions and how this may impact and contribute to violence against women crimes. Applicants are encouraged to present current census data relative to their specific area. Applicants should discuss current law enforcement, prosecution, and victim services responses to violence against women crimes in their service area. And finally, because collaboration is the keystone of a successful STOP project, applicants should discuss current cross-system collaboration amongst victim services, law enforcement, and prosecution. Okay. Now we're into the meat and potatoes of the application, which is your project description. Once you've addressed the needs of your service area, you will present your proposed project. You will need to select overarching goals from the STOP implementation plan, as well as federal purpose areas that align with your project. Selecting more purpose areas does not improve your score. It is about selecting ones that you identify as meeting the needs within your community, ones that you have the capacity to address, and ones that align with your project. Applicants need to identify core services being provided by key partners in the project. That would include law enforcement, prosecution, and victim services, as well as how the project will address the needs of culturally specific, underserved, and sexual assault victims as applicable. Applicants will need to present all applicable goals and objectives of the project and identify the year in which the objectives should be met. It is highly recommended that the goals be written in a SMART goal format. Applicants should select applicable guiding principles as discussed earlier and identify how they will be integrated into your project. Finally, applicants will need to discuss how they will maintain compliance with applicable federal certifications, also as discussed earlier in the presentation. Okay. Now we're into the budget detail and narrative, which is worth 30 points. And for this application, you just want to provide the first year's budget. As we talked about earlier and in the solicitation, years 2 and 3 will be submitted in e-grants through a continuation. Please ensure that justifications are provided for all proposed expenditures and that the expenditures clearly connect to your project proposal. Ensure that the funds are distributed as prescribed, and as we discussed, 25% law enforcement, 25% prosecution, 30% victim services, and 20% discretionary. Next slide. And then we have the evaluation section. In this section, applicants should describe how statistics will be tracked and maintained for the submission of the annual report, also known as the Muskie report. Applicants should tie these stats into the goals and objectives of the project and how these will be used to measure success and inform future decisions. There are links provided for the updated annual report and reporting form instructions that will take you to the Muskie School of Social Work. Next slide, please. So for required attachments, there's no points attached to this, but it's still very important that all required attachments are saved in e-grants. These include the signed VAWA certification, support letters if you're planning to do training, pass-through contracts as applicable, a list of STOP team members for current recipients of the grant, MOUs for work with faith-based community organizations as well as organizations serving underserved and culturally specific populations, MOUs for the STOP collaborative team if you're not currently receiving a grant that everybody's going to engage in this project, job descriptions for all funded positions, and DV, SA, and stalking protocols, and meeting minutes only for current STOP recipients. Next page. The executed signature page must be signed and uploaded to the main summary section of your application, following the signature page instructions available on PCC site. And just a public service announcement, I'm having difficulty dropping the PDF in to the chat. And I did see if any of my colleagues could do it. I tried it earlier and it worked fine, but for some reason it's not working now. So we'll make sure it's on the site if I can't get it into the chat. Thank you. And we're going to go to Des for the next slide.
Just a couple reminders here that we wanted to provide to everybody. Make sure to give yourself enough time to complete the application. If you have not completed a SAM registration, you need to allow a week or two to get these things into place. So it does take some time to do that portion of it if you don't already have one. Also, if your agency isn't registered in eGrants or you're not registered as a user in eGrants, you will need a day or two to get that set up as well. We do want to emphasize not to use another registered user's login and password to eGrants. You do have to have your own, and you do have to apply or get into eGrants with your own username and password. Also allow enough time to obtain any signatures on necessary grant forms, MOUs, or certification forms, and applications must be submitted in eGrants no later than Friday, May 3rd, 2024 by 11:59 p.m. Pass it over to Tanya.
Okay. And just some more helpful tips when you're doing an application. Make sure that you are concise and focused. Ensure that the goals that you write about are able to be met, that they're achievable and measurable. Assume that the person reading your application knows nothing about your county, and nothing about how you work with victims or why this proposed project is necessary. Have someone else review your application, somebody else at your agency. They can, give you some feedback. It's also recommended that you write some of your application in Microsoft Word or however you prefer. You can time out in eGrants. I think it's like 15 minutes or something. So it's just easier if you do it in another program, then copy paste it over. Mike?
Okay, so we're going to just go over a quick time frame of how this is going to play out for the application process. And so you must have your application submitted by May 3rd at midnight, and then it will be closed after that. At that point, we will do an administrative review, and then we'll distribute the applications to a selected review team. Teams will review and submit scores and recommendations. And then at that point, once we've selected the candidates, they'll be reviewed by VSAC and will be officially approved by VSAC, by the commission in September of 2024. And then by the end of September of 24, applicants will be informed of the decision. Successful applications will begin January 1st, 2025. Let's see. Okay, next slide.
So this is.
Oh, sorry, Nat. Do you want to?
That's all right.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to say that I see Julie had asked a question about the stalking protocol. When PCCD does these competitive applications, we have to be very careful. You're going to have to send that question through our resource account here. There's a hyperlink to it, and you'll have access to that. It's also listed in the copy of the solicitation. So that's right on like the first page of the solicitation. There's a link to that resource account. We take all the questions and we want to really make sure that everybody who could possibly have a question has access to the same information, and chances are other people will have that question as well, Julie. So if you could just send that again through the resource account. If you reach out to any one of us, Mike, Des, me, or Tanya, we will not be able to answer your questions directly. It's got to go that way. And then the way it works is we get those answers, we get those questions on the resource account. We work internally to prepare a response, and then we try to get those out within 2 days or so. And they are made available on the website so everybody can see them. Okay. There another slide. Yes, just some parting thoughts. Again, This presentation, even though it was an hour long, gave you the overview of the STOP competitive solicitation. Really encourage you, to read through the details of the solicitation and the STOP plan. Those are the keys. And as you look at those documents, if you have questions about the solicitation or the STOP plan, send them through the resource account. We appreciate everyone's attendance here. We hope that this was helpful, and this concludes our presentation. So Mike,
Nat-
were you able to drop that in the chat?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and apologize that for some reason it will not allow me to put the PDF into the chat now, even though I tried it earlier. And I'm assuming maybe it's because there's outside emails or people that aren't with the state that are on this, that it won't allow me to do that. But be aware that it will be on the website under the funding announcements along with the recording by the end of the week. So I apologize for any inconvenience. Thank you so much for joining us.